I stood outside their mansion, wearing an old jacket, clutching the small gift I brought for my son's wedding. They looked at me like I didn't belong there. Mrs. Collins, my daughter-in-law's mother, stared at me with disgust. Mrs. Collins, mocking. "Oh, you're his father? I thought he said his dad was a businessman." "Not a beggar," I forced a smile. "Me, ma'am, I'm just here to bless my son. I'm not here to impress anyone." That day they laughed at me, called me the poor, naive father, but they had no idea. The man they mocked once owned the company that paid for their luxury, and soon they'd regret every word. What happened next? My name is Richard Hale. For 30 years I built Hale Constructions, modest at first, then aggressive, then respected. We put up brownstones in Brooklyn, renovated townhouses on the Upper East Side, and finally built glass-fronted condos in Midtown that bankers would brag about. People called me stubborn. I called it dedication. I married Margaret when we were children in the eyes of the city. Young, hungry, hopeful. Margaret had an old-world steadiness, the kind that makes a house feel like home. We raised Daniel in a small townhouse near Hudson, taught him to play chess at the kitchen table, and we went to his school recitals on cold winter nights. Business took time, but we found our balance. I worked, she kept the family alive. Everyone assumed my success was only measured in buildings. It wasn't. It was measured in the way Margaret smiled when I walked through the door. When Margaret died, something inside me folded in on itself. I stopped going to certain board meetings. I sold one of the condos to a long-time partner, not because I had to, because I wanted a quieter life for Daniel. I had a cabin upstate, a lake you could see from the porch, and a small garden Margaret would have loved. Daniel was 27 then, ambitious and kind. He said, "Dad, don't leave everything behind. Let me run things. I can handle it." He wanted to prove himself. I didn't want to be the man haunting his son's success. So I handed the keys of the company to him, with the naive faith of a father who believed his child would do the right thing. Then came Sophie Collins. I met her at a spring fundraiser in Manhattan, a charity luncheon in a glass atrium off Fifth Avenue. She had the kind of smile people polished for photos. Sophisticated, practiced. Her parents, Edward and Victoria Collins, whispered the right names, talked about a townhouse in Tribeca, a luxury design business that did interiors for boutique hotels. They were polished. They were confident. They were everything a young man could be dazzled by. From the beginning, I liked Sophie. She was charming to my face, and she made Daniel light up in a way I hadn't seen since college. But there were moments, little things, that didn't line up. At a second dinner in their Manhattan apartment, the Collins marble countertop reflected more than our faces. It reflected tensions. Between sips of red wine, Edward said casually, "So, Richard, now that Daniel's in the company, maybe he can introduce us to a few investors." It was a joke, or at least he pretended it was. The way Victoria's eyes flicked to mine felt like a searchlight scanning for weakness. "Just retired, keeping things simple," I answered, letting my voice be calm. "Upstate cabin, private life." Victoria laughed in a way that sounded like a program. "Simple life, darling? That's almost quaint in Manhattan." It wasn't hostility, at least not outwardly. It was a subtle sizing up, the sort of behavior the city teaches rich people. They weren't rude, they were calculating. After that dinner, as we left their building and the doorman pressed a button to close the elevator, I remember the scent of new leather and the hush of their apartment and the familiar winter air as we stepped onto the street. I watched Victoria and Edward talk in low tones. They said things that sounded like harmless gossip, until I heard the name of a bank mentioned, then a figure, then the word security. I started noticing other signs. Sophie casually asking Daniel which properties were real investments and which were vanity projects. Victoria commenting on my clothes at the next family gathering. "Oh, Richard, you should take Daniel shopping for suits. He'll need them in the boardroom." Small digs. Innocuous, if you didn't read them like I did. They were probing, testing, seeing where advantage could be taken. It also became clear that the Collins firm, their so-called luxury design house, had problems. I sat with Daniel in my kitchen one evening, the old radio humming, and he confided in me, "Dad, Sophie's parents are stretched. They owe suppliers. A couple of their clients are late on payments. Sophie's been picking up the pieces." Daniel sounded worried more than angry. He trusted Sophie the way people trust their home, easily and without suspicion. I wanted to shelter him, I wanted to tell him everything. The whispers I heard, the veiled looks, the way lawyers tighten when an urgent call comes in. But how do you tell your son that the woman he loves might be a storm in disguise? How do you tell him that those who smile for family photos might be scouting for collateral? So I watched. Quietly, I let Daniel fall in love. I let the Collins family invite me to dinners. I listened to Victoria speak of expansion and Edward mention bridge loans. They were like weather patterns. You could see the storm front if you were paying attention. And yet, on one particular night, the last dinner before Daniel proposed to Sophie, something else happened that pushed all of it into focus. Victoria, in a private moment, divulged too much while inspecting my hands as if searching for signs of toil. "Richard," she said, casual and dangerously direct, "if you ever need help managing your assets, you should consider professional advice. There are ways to make sure your family keeps the legacy." Her words were a compliment wrapped in an assumption that I didn't know how to protect what I had. They assumed weakness. They assumed I would be grateful for their help. That is the moment I realized they didn't see me as family. They saw me as a ledger. They saw an asset. And when someone looks at another human being as a resource, they stop seeing their boundaries. That realization settled into me like cold iron. I left that night and drove the long way home, past Midtown's glass towers and through the quieter streets near the river, thinking of the chessboard of my life. Margaret's voice echoed, one of those memories that doesn't soothe but sharpens. She always said, "Never mistake kindness for weakness." I repeated it like a vow. By the time I sat on my upstate porch and watched the lake go black under the moon, the idea formed slow and deliberate. If they intended to treat me as a means to an end, then perhaps I would give them what they wanted. A show. Let them see the poor, naive father. Let them think I was easy to sweep aside, because if they were going to play the game, I would play it too. But I would not play it as the man they saw. I would play it as the man they underestimated. I decided to play along. When Sophie's mother called to invite me to the wedding planning meeting in their Manhattan apartment, I accepted. I could have said no. I could have stayed in the cabin and avoided the humiliation, but that would have been cowardice, and I wasn't ready to retreat. So I put on my old coat, the one Margaret had patched once, and took the train into the city. The town car dropped me on a rain-slick street under soft amber lights. The Collins building rose in polished glass. Their doorman opened the door as if ushering in royalty. Inside, the apartment smelled of lemon oil and fresh paint. Their interior had been curated to neutral perfection. White sofa, large abstract painting, designer lamps. Mrs. Collins gave me a cursory, almost rehearsed hug. "Richard, thank you for coming," she said, voice sweet like sugared tea. But her eyes measured me the way an appraiser measures a painting. Distance, value, potential resale. Sophie breezed up with that practiced smile. "Dad, he'll be fine," she said to Daniel, then louder so I could hear. "He knows how to behave." Behave? I thought, but I smiled and sat in the smallest chair. The planners were there. A woman with clipped hair and a leather portfolio. A man with a tablet who kept saying themes and aesthetic. They spoke in terms of colour palettes and guest lists, of champagne brands and menu pairings. I stayed quiet, letting the room's air do its work, make the poor man invisible. At one point, Mrs. Collins reached across to pat my hand in a public gesture. She leaned in conspiratorially and, with the kind of tone people use when giving charity, said, "Richard, everyone will love this. You'll see." Her hand was warm, but the words were an assessment, then the whisper from Sophie. She didn't know how loud she was. "He's going to embarrass us. Can't he just stay quiet?" The words landed like stones in my chest. My heart hurt, not because of the insult, but because Daniel, my son, whose eyes should have been on me for defense, said nothing. He looked down at the planner's tablet and adjusted a seating chart as if rearranging napkins could solve moral blindness. I had hoped he would step between me and that cutting remark, but he didn't. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he was avoiding conflict. Or maybe he simply hadn't seen the knife lined up for family. That night, after the meeting, as the crowd dispersed and the planners went over contracts, I lingered in the hallway to tie my shoe. The corridor was quiet, the security cameras humming. I heard voices, hushed, urgent. "Once the wedding's done, make him sign the investment papers," I heard Edward say. His voice was a low, steady thing. "We'll use his name to secure the loan." "Daniel trusts me," Sophie answered, softer, but with a firmness that chilled me. "After we get the money, I'll convince him to sell that house upstate. It's the only asset he still really cares about." For a second, the world went thin, like paper between a flame and breath. Use my son, use his future. Take the house we'd built with Margaret in memory and turn it into currency. The thought was a betrayal that hit deeper than any insult ever could. I remember gripping the stair rail so hard my knuckles went white. There are moments when a man's life pivots on a single overheard sentence. This was one of them. I could have burst forward, dragged them into the corridor, demanded answers, revealed everything. But I didn't. My training, business sense, and the curve of patience told me to let it play out. If they were going to conspire, I wanted them to show their full cards. So I let the game continue. I let them believe the old jacket, the quiet voice, the country home, all of it meant I was harmless. I let them feel that smug certainty, and I memorized every detail of their plan like a ledger entry. Names, dates, phrases. How Sophie said, "Sell that house," as if it were a natural step, not a theft. That night, on the train back upstate, I sat with my hands folded. I thought of Margaret's hands folding laundry, of Daniel's first day of school, and the scraped knee I'd bandaged. The thought of my son being used like a signature on a loan agreement, a pawn to secure someone else's debts, filled me with an anger the city had no name for. The next morning, I called an old friend from the industry, Mark Ellis, a lawyer who once handled our acquisition deals. "Mark," I said without preamble, "I need you to look into a bridge loan application on a company called Collins & Co. And don't mention me." Mark's voice on the other end was blunt. "Richard, why are you meddling?" "Because," I said slowly, "I don't want my son's name used as collateral." He paused, then said, "If you're serious, you'll need proof, documents, a trail." And so I began to collect those threads, small things at first. A vendor's invoice left visible on the Collins firm's website, a social media post about postponed installations, a whispered reference to a bank line of credit. I walked into suppliers that the Collins firm used and listened. I sat in coffee shops near their office in Soho and watched employees come and go. Everything they weren't saying in public, I started to find in private. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to float on trust. He told me, "Dad, they're under pressure, but Sophie's honest. We'll help them." He smiled in that trusting way and believed he was doing the right thing. I wanted to pound him and beg him to look harder, but I had to be prudent. Anger without a plan is just noise, so I built a plan. I would let them think they were maneuvering me. I would be the poor, naive father they laughed at. I would let them take small bites to prove the size of the animal at the table. But every time they reached, I would document it. Every hint, every lie, every manipulated signature. By the time they tried to secure the loan with Daniel's name, I intended for them to walk into a room and find the person they estimated as nothing standing at the head of the table. Because soon, and I mean very soon, they would learn who they were dealing with. The wedding day arrived like a bright lie. It was all chandeliers and champagne, a string quartet playing as if the world had no shadows. They seated me in the corner, on a chair that looked like an afterthought. The plate in front of me held the smallest portion, a trimmed slice of meat, a fork that felt foreign in my hands. Around me, the Collins family smiled for photos with that practiced ease of people who never see consequences. When I rose to give my blessing, my voice cracked once, the sort of honest crack nobody could fake. Daniel gripped my hand and smiled as if the universe approved. The guests applauded. Sophie placed his arm around hers and gave me a look that said everything and nothing at once. She leaned in, low enough for only her to hear, and whispered, "Don't embarrass us, Richard." She lingered on the word embarrass as if it were a final verdict. After the ceremony, when everyone's attention was distracted by flower bouquets and toasts, I handed Daniel an envelope. He slid it into his jacket pocket without opening it. Sophie's smirk was quick and light, a small knife disguised as a smile. "Oh, another letter of advice?" she said, loud enough for a few to laugh. "No, dear," I said, calm like ice. "Just something for later." Inside that thin envelope was not sentiment. It was a document with legal language and a seal, a share transfer for Hale Constructions. For 6 months, I had been moving quietly, like a man digging a tunnel beneath an unsuspecting house. I bought back the company using a web of holding entities. I kept my name off the obvious papers, and the new face of the business was called RH Holdings. Only a close circle knew. Only I and Mark and a handful of trusted accountants held the ledger. You have to understand what I did not do. I didn't shout. I didn't stage a dramatic interruption at the reception. I didn't hurl accusations like confetti. Instead, I let the machinery of law and business do the shouting for me. Men like Edward Collins think they can buy outcomes with charm and signatures. They never consider clauses until those clauses sit across their table and close the door. A week after the wedding, a loan application landed on my desk. The paper bore their smiling faces from the wedding album. Sophie with her practiced grin, Edward with a conciliatory handshake. The application asked for a multi-million-dollar bridge loan to scale operations for Collins & Co. And, as I suspected, the requested guarantor was Daniel Hale. Imagine their irony, using my son's name to secure money to fix their own debts, all while sneering at the man who had built those very assets. They had done the work for me. They had shown their hand. I called Mark. "Bring the papers," I said. "Bring the loan documents, the bank correspondence, everything you have." When Mark arrived, grey hair, old courtroom voice, we laid their file out on my corner office table. We traced signatures, compared corporate names, followed wires. Lawyers love to see a trail, emails, timestamps, phone records. We found hurried emails from Edward to a broker, late-night messages promising collateral, a supplier's letter marked overdue. They had been building a house of cards, and now the wind had a direction. I signed the approval. Not for their loan, for the clause that would be the hinge of everything, the collateral clause that placed Collins & Co. itself, every design contract, every showroom fixture, every future profit, under the security interest. In plainer terms, if they defaulted, the lender could take the firm, and I was the lender. People think power is only in money. Power is also in timing and in the quiet certainty of preparation. I made sure the bank's legal counsel understood there could be no ambiguity. Mark drafted amendments, we notarized documents, and the transfer of Hale Constructions into RH Holdings was completed on a grey Tuesday. All legal, all irreversible, all done while they smiled at my son's new cufflinks at the wedding. 2 weeks later, as if the city itself had a pulse to match my plan, the Collins firm missed a payment. A supplier called. A client delayed a deposit. Panic turned their polished meetings into whispered frenzy. They scrambled to refinance, to patch holes with new promises. In desperation, they pulled the same strings they'd always relied on. Name-dropping, friendship calls, half-truths. When none of it worked, the broker called me, the lender, asking what next steps we might consider. I could have taken the slow route. I could have watched them fail in silence. But I needed to make a statement. When people treat another human as a stepping stone, there must be a moment when the stepping stone stands up. So I dressed the way the world would notice. A tailored black suit, shoes shined until they could reflect faces. I hired 2 associates to handle PR and logistics. We arranged a discreet meeting to sign foreclosure notices. Then I arrived in the city in a silver Mercedes. The car rolled up to their building like a punctuation mark. When I stepped out on that slick pavement, the rain made the lights smear into long yellow strokes. I adjusted my cuff. felt the weight of every document in my briefcase, and walked into the building as if it were my own. I thought of Margaret's hands folded in the kitchen. I thought of Daniel's childhood laugh. I thought of the countless mornings I'd spent signing contracts and balancing ledgers, the years of graft that most people never saw. They'd called me naive. They'd called me poor. They'd called me invisible. But that day, I wanted them to see plainly the cost of their arrogance, the human ledger they'd tried to erase. The plan wasn't spectacle for spectacle's sake. It was a correction, a recalibration. And as the doorman opened the door and the warm hallway light spilled out, I straightened my shoulders. The lawyers walked behind me, papers in hand. The security camera above the lobby blinked like an indifferent eye. I was ready. The Collins mansion that used to look down on me like a judge's gallery was quieter than I expected. The chandeliers still glittered, but the laughter was absent, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. I stepped across the marble floor with 2 lawyers behind me and a stack of documents in my hand that felt heavier than steel. The doorman's eyes flicked between my suit and my briefcase, sensing the wrongness of a familiar scene. Mrs. Collins was the first to stand. Her posture was the same practiced poise she had used to dismiss me at dinners. Immaculate, automatic. The moment her eyes landed on me, something in that composure splintered. She said my name like a question. "Richard, what's the meaning of this?" Her voice was high, brittle. Around her, the room hummed with the undercurrent of shock. Sophie clinging to a small vase as if it might anchor her. Edward, with one hand tightened on a glass. Daniel frozen in the doorway. I folded my paper slowly, like a man closing a book he has already read. I put the documents on the polished table and looked at each of them, in their eyes, in the room that had once celebrated itself, and spoke as if I was reading from the ledger of truth. "Business, ma'am," I said, measured. "RH Holdings now owns your firm. I believe you know the man in charge." There was a pause long enough for the chandelier to tick in my ears. I let it hang, savouring the way the silence rearranged itself around us. Then I said the words I'd rehearsed in 1,000 quiet ways in the dark. "It's me." Colour left their faces like paint washed off a statue. For a moment, the room moved as if someone had reversed time and taken the confidence out of everyone who'd once worn it like armour. Mr. Collins barked, disbelief sharpening his voice. "You tricked us!" I let the words sit before I answered. "No," I said quietly. "You tricked yourselves. You saw kindness as weakness." Sophie's breath hitched. The look she gave Daniel was the blend of panic and calculation I'd seen before. The micro-expression of someone rearranging blame. "Your father ruined us," she cried. The accusation, more a prayer to anyone who would listen than a statement of fact. Daniel's shoulders unknotted in a way I had not expected. The man I'd watched at chess with toys now stood like a young father, facing an impossible reckoning. He turned to her, not at me. His voice was raw. "No, Sophie, you ruined yourself. I want you to imagine that instant in slow motion. The way Sophie's smile dissolved into something brittle. The way Mr. Collins's jaw set and fell as if someone had pulled a cloth from his face. The mansion's great windows reflected their faces back at them, multiplied, a room full of denials and lies. My lawyers walked them through the documents, notarized transfer papers, corporate filings, a clear chain showing Hale Constructions' transfer into RH Holdings. We read the clause that had sent their plans collapsing. The security interest, the perfected lien, the bank correspondence. We showed the bridge loan application that had named Daniel as guarantor and the sequence of emails where Edward explicitly proposed using Daniel's signature to secure funds. Legalese can be cold. In that room it felt like a judge. There were protests. "You can't do this," Mrs. Collins said. "There must be an error." There was also the sound I'd been waiting for, the silence where excuses evaporated. The vendors called later that day and said the same thing. Invoices unpaid, contracts in arrears. The clients slipped away. For all their manicured appearances, they were exposed as something fragile, held together by borrowed time and borrowed money. I watched Daniel read the emails we'd printed for him. His throat worked. His face, which had been a mixture of embarrassment and confusion since the wedding, now burned with something closer to horror. He looked up at me, and in that look I saw the man who'd once learned how to tie his shoelaces at my kitchen table. He said one word, "Dad." He didn't need to finish. The apology poured out of him in waves. The realization that his love had been a ledger entry, that his marriage had been arranged around what someone else thought they could gain. He took my hands in both of his, and for a moment, we were just father and son. He said through tears, "I didn't see it. I'm sorry." I told him the truth I had kept steady like a keel. "Son, money can blind people, but it can't buy loyalty. I mean those words. They cut more cleanly for being simple." He nodded, the way someone washed by a storm might nod and begin to rebuild. The room fractured more after that. There were calls, frantic conversations behind closed doors. There were threats, of course. Mrs. Collins, voice sharpened by the kind of fear money rarely meets, shouted from their study as I left. "You'll regret this!" I paused in the foyer, the echo of her words bouncing off the marble, the empire of their insults, the architecture of their contempt. It all seemed so small in that moment. I turned back slowly, the city light from the foyer windows reaming my silhouette. "I already did," I said, calm as the lake at dawn. "The day you mocked a man who gave up everything for love." Those words landed heavier than any legal notice. They were not a victory speech. They were a closure. I had not come to enjoy ruin. I had come to correct a wrong. The collapse of the Collins false security was a necessary medicine. Bitter, immediate, but for some, perhaps life-saving in the long run. Outside, the evening air felt misaligned. The taxi idled, rain had begun again, and the city hummed as if nothing had happened. But inside that house, something fundamental had shifted. A truth rediscovered, a deception unveiled, and relationships laid bare. As I closed the door behind me, I did not feel triumphant. I felt vindicated and very tired. Revenge had been precise. Its cost would be paid not only by them, but by the fractures left in my son's life. That weighed on me more than any headline could. Months passed. Daniel divorced Sophie quietly. No media, no noise, just a man closing a painful chapter of his life. He moved into a small apartment in Brooklyn, started coming to the office every morning, not as my son, but as a man determined to earn back his own name. I watched him from my office window some days. The same young man who once believed money defined respect, now building it from scratch. He never asked for special treatment. And that made me prouder than any business deal I ever signed. As for me, I still keep that old jacket, the one I wore when they called me the poor, naive father. It hangs by the door of my study, a reminder of two truths: the day I played a fool, and the day I stopped pretending. Never underestimate someone because of how they look. Some of the quietest people carry the loudest power, and sometimes revenge isn't about destroying others. It's about reclaiming your worth. If you believe revenge should always come with a lesson, then hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because more real, powerful stories like this are coming soon, only on Ultimate Revenge.